What would be different in your church, in your community, if the people in your congregation were profoundly, deeply, and overwhelmingly gripped by the supreme sacrifice of Christ? This sermon, What's Missing, reveals a stunning answer to these questions. The purpose of this video is to help you study and prepare to preach the first sermon in the Giving is Living series, What's Missing? What is different? What is different in your community because your church exists? To ask this question in a more provocative way, would your church be missed if it ceased to exist? So let's look deeply into the Scripture for answers to these questions. The Apostle Paul is collecting money, relief funds, funds to take to the poor, suffering saints in Jerusalem. As he traveled, he frequently exchanged letters with the church in Corinth, sometimes just to answer questions that had been sent to him, at other times writing to correct doctrinal errors and help them with their worship practices, and even at other times to encourage these saints in their spiritual growth. Paul is about to depart for Jerusalem, so he writes to remind the Corinthian Christians about a promise they had made almost a year ago to give money to relieve the sufferings of the Christians there. To encourage the Corinthians to keep their promise, Paul shares his personal, first-hand eyewitness account about how the Macedonians stepped up to help the saints in Jerusalem. This is an incredible story, an almost bizarre story about an act of generosity by the Macedonian Christians. You see, life was extremely challenging for the Macedonians as well. They too were experiencing severe trials, so severe that the only words that came to Paul's mind were extreme, a severe ordeal of affliction. Yet, when these Macedonians heard about the poor suffering saints in Jerusalem, they spontaneously responded with overflowing joy, which, as Paul put it, welled up and overflowed in rich generosity. Paul writes that they not only gave as much as they were able, they gave beyond their ability, entirely on their own. In other words, no one commanded them to give. No one shamed them into giving. There was no special 40-day program, no law, no mandate, no tax. No one coerced them into giving with false biblical promises. This act of giving was nothing short of stunning. Listen to this. Paul writes that these Macedonians urgently pleaded for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the suffering saints in Jerusalem. In other words, they literally begged Paul for the opportunity to give. Pastor, could you imagine your astonishment if the people in your church knocked on your door and begged you for the privilege to give? As Paul put it, they did not give as he expected. After all, little if anything is expected from poor people, right? So how does one explain this incomprehensible, this puzzling behavior? Paul answers this question in verse 5. Simply stated, they gave themselves first to the Lord. Then they gave themselves to Paul, all in keeping with God's will, the way that God intended. The point is this. These poor Macedonians went beyond what was ordinarily expected of them. That is, they excelled. That's what it means to excel, to go just a little bit beyond what is ordinarily expected. So what are the big headlines in this passage? You see, This is not a story about trials, sufferings, poverty, extraordinary giving by superhero Christians. What really happened here? I suggest there are two major headlines in this story. Headline number one: this is a story about a church, a people captured by the supreme sacrifice of Christ. Gripped by the reality of Christ's giving, the Macedonians were freed to enthusiastically participate in God's plan to renew all things. Freed to give revival, freed to give refreshing, freed to give the long-looked-for jubilee. They were freed to create zones of liberation, redemption, and rest, supreme rest to the weary souls around them. Headline number two: the same graces given to the Macedonians are given to you. As giving is the distinctive character of Christ, giving becomes the distinctive characteristic of Christ's people. I suggest that a review of Acts 2 and 4 about the life of the early church would provide excellent examples for this. The joyful, uninhibited giving of their time, talent, and especially their treasure became the organizing principle of their life, living the life that is truly life, living the life that God has always intended. The call to action for this sermon summons each person in your congregation to identify a specific area of life in which, for the next 7 days, they will practice behaviors that are characteristic of those who are learning to excel in the grace of giving, but not with money, rather with the giving of themselves. This sermon provides some examples of areas in which giving might be important, like giving more time to caring for children, assisting their spouse. Others could give some effort in assisting a neighbor, completing some task within the church. Some might even consider practicing giving a gracious smile or an encouraging greeting to others. There may be some in the congregation who would rise to the challenge of giving the gift of patience to others in their home, or forgiveness to those who seem immature in how they treat others. I know you can provide other giving opportunities as you share them with your congregation. Encourage them to think of and share ideas of their own. One final thought regarding the call to action for this sermon. The major headline in this sermon is about a people that were gripped, seized, as it were, by the supreme sacrifice of Christ. I suspect there are two kinds of people in your congregation. First, there are those who have yet to put their faith, their trust, and life into the hands of God. They have not made a commitment for Christ. Therefore, it will be impossible for them to embrace the giving life. Following your invitation to excel in the grace of giving, I encourage you to address this matter by extending Christ's offer to receive Him. Second, there are people in your congregation who proclaim Christ, but have never considered the supreme sacrifice of Christ. This reality also provides an excellent opportunity for you to invite their complete surrender to Him. Remember verse 5? They first gave themselves to the Lord. Then they were able to give to others. Pastor, I urge you to model the grace of giving for your congregation. Be the very first to give this week and throughout the sermon series. Share your giving experiences with your congregation. This will teach them far more than the content of this sermon series. God bless you as you prayerfully prepare to preach What's Missing